After a disappointing 2023 season, the Seattle Seahawks have overhauled the coaching staff and now enter into a new era. And I believe that under Mike Macdonald, this team has become one of the biggest threats in the NFC. But let me explain. Now let me pump the brakes. Your interpretation of what being a threat in the NFC might be different than my interpretation of being a threat in the NFC. In my opinion, this Seattle Seahawks team is currently constructed and built to be an absolute menace in the postseason. Does that mean this team's going to win a championship? I don't know. Quite frankly, I don't think so. However, I think this team can make a deep playoff run, and I think if the right pieces fall to them in this year's draft, this team is going to be scary good next year. So the way I'll explain this team to you guys, I'm going to be breaking this team down by two segments. What is good about the team and what is bad about the team. And at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys my final synopsis of what I think this team can be heading into the 2024 season. So we will begin with what I like about this team, and we're actually going to begin with the defensive side of things rather than the offense, because I actually do think this defense can be pretty solid next year. Now, it's no joke that this defense was one of the worst defenses in the entire NFL last year, and I still don't think this defense is perfect, but I definitely do think that on paper, position by position, I do think this team is actually constructed quite nicely. We're going to begin with the strengths of this defense, and that is going to be their two star cornerbacks in Tariq Woolen and Devon Witherspoon. I don't think it's any doubt that Tariq Woolen definitely did take a small step back last year, but I still think that he's one of those guys who can be a lockdown corner, and I do think him moving into that cornerback 2 spot alongside Devon Witherspoon playing more of that cornerback 1 role will benefit him and honestly will benefit Devon Witherspoon. In my opinion, Devon Witherspoon was completely deserving of the Defensive Rookie of the Year award. In fact, I had him as my favorite the entire season. And after a successful rookie season, I do think he's going to continue to take strides into his second year to be even a better corner for this team. They also brought in somebody in the safety room in Rayshawn Jenkins, who I think could be a solid safety starter for this team. Do I think that he's this all-pro free safety anymore? Probably not, but I still think he's good enough to get the job done. You still have Julian Love in that strong safety position, and I still think that's a pretty good spot for that team. Looking past the secondary, you can look into the linebacker room and see a lot of improvements based off of last year. They brought in Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dodson to replace the two linebackers they lost this offseason, and I think these are really good replacements for what this team needs. Tyrell Dodson is one of the most underrated players in the entire NFL, and I truly do believe that he can be a very good rotational starting linebacker for this team. Jerome Baker has been a consistent player when healthy, even though he's had some injuries the past couple years. When healthy, he's one of the best players on that Miami Dolphins defense, and I do think he's going to be a very solid player for the Seattle Seahawks defense. Looking a little bit further into it, looking at the defensive line, I still think there's a couple pieces they would like to add, primarily another pass rusher alongside Boy Mafe. Boy Mafe is a very consistent 9 to 10 sack guy. Some other guys like Jermont Jones, Jaron Reed, are some guys who can contribute in the pass rushing game as well. And then of course you're able to bring back Leonard Williams, and they also brought in Jonathan Hankins, who I do think can bear down in the middle of this defense to be a good run stuffer. Does this current group of guys stop you from taking an interior or an exterior defensive lineman in the draft? Absolutely not. Would I take one in the first round? Maybe only if like a Dallas Turner or a Jared Verse were available, but if those guys are taken, then I'm probably just going to stick with the offensive line. Which that now transitions us over to the offensive side of things, and I think there's a lot of things you have to like about the Seattle Seahawks offense. For starters, they have a very good 1-2 running back combination with Kenneth Walker III and Zach Charbonnet. Kenneth Walker is more of your speedy hybrid back who can also get involved in the passing game, whereas Zach Charbonnet is a much more bruisier bowling ball style running back, which you're definitely going to need, especially alongside the goal line. These guys complement each other's games quite nicely, and I thought it was a very good pickup last year, and I do expect Zach Charbonnet to continue to pick up his pace and be an even better player next year. And of course, you really can't talk about this Seattle Seahawks team without bringing up their weapons, because DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Noah Fant present some of the best weapons in the entire NFL. DK Metcalf is a true number 1 wide receiver who is one of those special wide receivers that not every single team has. He's big, he's physical, he can make big plays. Do I think he's a little bit overrated at times? Sometimes, but I still think he's a top 15 wide receiver in the league and a true number 1 wide receiver with no doubt. Tyler Lockett more than likely will be moving into that receiver 3 role this year, with Jackson Smith and Jigba moving up to that number 2 spot. I do think this was sort of a natural progression for Jackson Smith and Jigba. After last year, he primarily played as the number 3 guy. I do expect this year his role and his catches to increase and for him to get more playmaking abilities. I think with more emphasis on getting Jackson Smith and Jigba the ball more, I do think that's going to benefit this offense a ton. Jackson Smith and Jigba is somebody who can play on the inside but can also play on the outside. I would primarily say he's going to play on the inside for the Seahawks team again next year, but I want to see this team utilize his skills and his ability, because I thought last year they didn't really do that till later in the season. And of course, we got to talk about the quarterback room, which I actually do think is one of the better quarterback rooms in the entire NFL. There are a ton of teams out there that don't have a consistent starter, and I will say at least the Seattle Seahawks have one for now. I know Geno Smith is sort of a controversial figure because He's a very good player at times, but it isn't quite good enough to get the job done. Me personally, I do think he's a quarterback who could get the job done on the Seattle Seahawks team. I just think you have to build a very good team around him. And the nice thing about Geno Smith is he's not super expensive. So if you want to get rid of him for a young rookie quarterback, which we're going to talk about here in a second, you could do so and move off of him pretty easily. Geno Smith is a very good starter, and I don't want to undermine him. He's around a top 15 to top 20 quarterback in this league. And as I mentioned earlier, I really do think he could get the job done for this team. But I can sit here and say that all I want until we actually see it. It's going to have to continue to just be a prediction. They also traded for Sam Howell to be their backup quarterback and somewhat of mentee to Geno Smith. And I actually really like this move for the Seattle Seahawks. I actually really liked the move when it happened, and I like the move even more today. Sam Howell had a up and down first year starting for the Washington Commanders with a lot more ups early on in the season with a lot more downs as the season went on. Sam Howell at one point looked like a promising starter for the Commanders, but of course, after getting the number 2 overall pick, they're going to go probably get a Drake May or a Jaden Daniels, which then allows him to sit behind a veteran in Geno Smith and learn behind him for a year, maybe even 2 years, to eventually at some point potentially be the starting quarterback for this team. Sam Howell has a lot of attributes that you would want in your starting quarterback. He has a strong arm, good mobility, can be a good playmaker. I think all in all, he's one of those guys who isn't necessarily a star, but I think at some point could potentially be a top 10 quarterback if all things do fall for him. With that being said, there's a lot of things and a lot of dominoes that have to fall for him in order to be that guy, but if he can have that happen, great. Regardless of that though, I still think that Geno Smith will be the starter this year and even potentially next year. And I also do believe that this is a team that could be aggressive, maybe not this year, but potentially next year or the year after, to go out there and actually get their true franchise quarterback in the NFL draft if a guy like a Sam Howell does not pan out. So of course, just on the roster wise, the offense and defense looks pretty solid, but let's actually now talk about what I don't like about this team, and there's a couple of things I don't like about this team. For starters, the offensive line took a massive step back last year. Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas did not play as good as they did just a few years back, and even though I do think those guys can play even better next year into a new system, it is not easy to say that they're just going to return back to form and be even better. Again, you're kind of stuck to roll with those guys because of what you saw a few years ago, so more than likely those two guys will be your starter, but they did bring in George Fant in case one of those guys gets injured or just doesn't play very well, and George Fant could be your swing tackle starter who could be pretty solid on both sides. Laken Tomlinson will fill in at that left guard spot more than likely unless they draft somebody, which I do suppose that they probably will. If that's the case, if Laken Tomlinson is the start, I do think he's a decent enough starting guard. With that being said though, you're likely going to have him be your left guard starter or left guard backup. Nick Harris at center is an interesting player. He's had his ups and downs, and even though I don't think he's a fantastic center, I definitely do think he's good enough to get the job done. Anthony Bradford at right guard is a younger player, kind of similar to Nick Harris. I think he can get the job done, but ideally, these are not guys who just blow me away. And that's kind of my opinion about this whole entire offensive line. There is some talent on the board here, like Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas, but after a pretty poor performance last year, I do have my doubts about this offensive line. Now, as I've mentioned before, I do think this team will likely take an offensive lineman in this year's draft, whether that's a Jackson Powers Johnson, a Troy Fatanu, or a J.C. Latham. Any of those guys would fill in nicely along this offensive line to make it a slightly bit better. Of all the guys I mentioned, I think Jackson Powers Johnson would be a fantastic fit both at left guard or center for this team and would be an absolute bowling ball up the middle that this team could desperately use. Next thing I don't really like about this team is the fact that they are a bit of an older roster. Now, yes, they do have some young guys like their running back room, some of their younger receivers like Jackson Smith and Jigba, some young guys on the offensive line, and a couple pieces on the defense that are pretty young. But in your major positions, such as your quarterback spot, your wide receiver one, basically most of your defensive linemen outside of Boy Mafe, you do have a lot of older players. And I think with that being said, are they like 30 years old? No, they're still young enough to get the job done for the next 4 to 5 years. But I just don't know if this team currently has the current roster construction to be a championship contender quite yet. Again, I don't want to spoil anything. This team can make a run for it. I just don't know if they're necessarily built to win a championship quite yet. But when you're at that stage, ideally you're a younger team that is just a few pieces away. For example, like the Indianapolis Colts, for example, are kind of stuck in a situation where I think they're good enough to be contenders, but they don't have the pieces quite yet to win a championship, even though I kind of actually do like the Colts this year. So you look at the Seahawks team, there's a lot of good pieces, but a lot of older pieces as well that I just don't know if this entire team as they're built right now is good enough to win a championship. And I think by the time this team is championship contender worthy, some of those older guys might be getting replaced by younger players or so on and so forth. The next thing I don't like about this team is going to be their cap space situation moving forward. As it sits right now, they have $1 million in open cap, which more than likely means they're going to be done looking for free agents this year. They only have $2 million potentially open up next year. Now, yes, you can restructure contracts and cut certain players, but just as we sit right now, they don't have a ton of money to really work with. Of course, NFL free agency isn't quite like the NBA where you have a bunch of big name guys go into the free market and get massive contracts. But if you can go out there and get some guys like, for example, a Christian Wilkins, that would definitely be nice, but they don't really have the cap space to actually make those moves. The next thing I don't like about this team is going to be they're in a super tough division. Obviously, you have to deal with the San Francisco 49ers for the next 4 to 5 years. As long as Brock Purdy's still playing at this level, we're talking about a team that's going to be a continuous contender in that division. And with the Seahawks trying to be able or trying to contend for championships, they're going to have to go through the San Francisco 49ers, and we just haven't quite seen this team be able to get over the hump and beat that team. You also look at teams like the LA Rams, who are continuous threats within that division, and I don't see that team going away anytime soon. As long as Matthew Stafford's there and McVay's still there, that's a team that's going to be tough to beat, and I just don't think that's going to be a team that this team will be able to beat very often. And then you have the Arizona Cardinals, who I plan on making a video on pretty soon because I'm actually pretty high on them next year. They aren't really right now a threat for the Seattle Seahawks, especially if they're trying to compete for a playoff spot or even some championships, but 2 to 3 years down the line, I think that Cardinals team could definitely be a legitimate threat to the Seattle Seahawks team. They got Kyler Murray, they're probably going to get Marvin Harrison Jr. and some defensive player in the back end of the first round, and they had a very successful draft last year, and I think this team is in general heading in the right direction. So for Seattle, you're dealing with a very solid LA Rams team, a very solid to great 49ers team, and what's going to be a very good team in the Arizona Cardinals. But with that all being said, let me give you guys my final synopsis of this team and what I think this team can be moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, do I think this team is going to win a championship next year? Probably not. Do I think they have a chance to win a championship next year? Maybe. I would give it like a 0.05% chance because I think there's better teams out there like Detroit or Philly or San Francisco, but I still think the Seattle Seahawks team has the pieces and the makeup to be a playoff team that could be a legitimate threat to any contender next year in the playoffs. I kind of think of this team sort of like the last few years of Russell Wilson's career, where they were good enough to make the playoffs, but they would ultimately lose in the first or second round. I kind of think that's what the Seahawks team can be. Could they make that run to win a championship? Maybe. I just don't think it's going to be the case next year. But if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.